You are listening to 95.7 FM WELT, Fort Wayne, Radioactive. The opinions and views expressed in this show are those of the hosts and guests only. They do not represent those of FreeThought Fort Wayne, WELT, or any other organization. Welcome to the Hoosier Humanist Hour, where we explore science, religion, culture, ethics, and community from the humanist perspective. Join us as we discuss those topics and more, free from the ideologies of religion and superstition.
Good evening and welcome to the Hoosier Humanist Hour. This is a show brought to you by volunteers from FreeThought Fort Wayne. The Hoosier Humanist Hour is a show dedicated to discussions on all things humanism and or from the humanist perspective. My name is Caleb. I'm joined today by Dee and Andrew. How you guys doing?
Hello, good. Great.
Awesome. All right, well, today's topic, the title of the episode anyway, is Atheist Religious Experiences. This is a topic that hopefully everyone can relate to, at least on some level. Honestly, if you can't relate to it, you're probably a sociopath. But the vast majority of us can understand what somebody else means when they say they had a spiritual experience, for example. So before we begin, I thought it'd be kind of important to make a distinction, because I think some people tend to have a pretty loose definition of religious. Some people would say that anything that somebody is really fervent about, that they feel compelled to do over and over again, something that drives them, that they're very intense about, could be considered religious in some way. But I think these definitions are a little bit too loosey-goosey. For example, under this definition, you could define football as religious. And because there are people who are obsessed with football, but I think it's kind of absurd to associate any religious terminology, ideology, whatever, to football. So when I talk about a religious experience, I'm usually referring to what we would probably call a spiritual experience. And we'll kind of get into that a little bit more down the line. And I would consider somebody who's doing something religiously to be somebody who's doing something as though they are worshiping it, at the very least at the level of, say, a king, for example. So those are just my terms before we begin, and because I really want my position on this to be as clear as possible. So I thought that I'd actually begin by using Richard Dawkins as a sort of paradigm. Richard Dawkins is well known for his views on the human condition. He's often quoted saying something along the lines of DNA creates the music, and we dance to its tune. And I love that, and I'd love to explain my position on atheist religious experience while incorporating this metaphor in some way in the hope that my position will be more clearly and easily understood. So I'm actually of the opinion that many of these songs that are sung by DNA are really synonymous with the siren's call. We're compelled to dance to its music. We're blindly drawn in by its magnificence, yet DNA's influence often arrests us, bewildering us with its capacity to captivate our attention. Now, there are very real and very strong emotional and physiological responses that every human being is susceptible. We often label these things transcendent or spiritual. It's very possible that this allure of the transcendent stems from an inherent drive to understand that which is mysterious or mystical to us. So, for those of us who can feel its beat or hear its music, DNA could be said to choreograph the primal and the sentient, while really only guiding the will and the ego. So to avoid the rocks, all we really need to do is resist the siren's call. The trick is learning to distinguish between the voice of the siren and the voice of reason. The latter provides protection from the former, and really it helps equip us with the capacity to resist that deadly call, that urge to just go for the rocks regardless of the dangers. So while it could be said that there's a continuum for this capacity to resist, very few of us are actually deaf to their songs altogether. And for what we can call this song Transcendent Rhapsody, if you will, so Transcendent Rhapsody is really no exception. While the sirens sing their song in the key of why, the voice of reason prefers the key of how. The key of why might admittedly be more easily understood, while at the same time striking all the right primal chords. The key of how, it seems to me, appeals to those who prefer more provable continuity with reality, regardless of the technical challenges involved. And it could be said that our personal experiences are playing songs of their own. However, there's really no escaping the fact that personal experience and DNA are both continually fighting for control over the volume. And unfortunately, more often than not, it's the key of why that remains more palatable to most people, and thus most of us are actually headed towards the rocks more often than not. Our compulsion to dance to DNA's tune it's only natural, and the realization that we are, in fact, dancing to its music can aid us in acknowledging and thereby overcoming our own biases. It's very difficult for even the most skeptical among us to completely divorce the transcendent or the luminous from the supernatural. I believe it's the case that the supernatural appeals more towards our primal instincts, more so than our natural inclination to reason in most cases. And I may not be the first to articulate this concern. However, I do feel it's worth reiterating that although the appeal of the supernatural is strong, it will always, in every case, no matter what you're doing, no matter where you are, be in your best interests to just assume that no such dimension will ever interfere or interact with the natural realm in any conceivable way. Just don't think that it'll ever actually affect you in the real world. It's just unreasonable. So for those of us who like the appeal of the supernatural, for those of us who appeal to logic, rather, to reason or skepticism, the difficulty lies in not losing that sense of transcendent awe, that sense of wonder, the capacity to comprehend beauty in all its depth. And I believe that the secret to accomplishing this goal is relatively simple. We really just need to replace the supernatural and superstition with the natural and the material. And if you think about it, this really isn't that difficult to do. Everything that we comprehend and perceive already stems from the natural and the material. So just enjoy the moment. There's really no need to add any superfluous baggage here. Materialistic, ontological understanding of the natural world does not siphon our capacity to experience transcendent awe. For example, a newborn child is still beautiful even if you know a stork wasn't involved. In just the same way that the beauty of spring's rebirth isn't diminished by our understanding of the solstice. Atheists like myself, like my colleagues, like many of my friends, like many of you out there, atheists are more than capable of experiencing their own religious experiences. Now, D, to kind of pass the ball on to you, there are 80 million Americans right now that call themselves spiritual, but not religious. And at the same time, a little over 25% of the population identify as atheist, meaning there is a very large portion of the population that want to experience the luminous and the transcendent and the mystical, but without having to necessarily associate all of that religious baggage. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's basically me, right? And you that you're describing? I definitely, coming from religion myself, first and foremost, I would say the religious experiences I have as a non-religious person are far more powerful than anything I had when I was a religious person. That's for sure. Yes.
I was never all that particularly religious, so I don't really have that much of a comparison to make, but I honestly always assumed, were you one of those people that happened to be, singing with their hands in the air, eyes closed, tears coming down the face kind of a...
No, I mean, I could have been. I feel like I was that crazy. But basically, any religious experience that I remember as a religious person was some kind of maybe feeling of connection with God. It was very much a emotional feeling, and I, would convince myself of it as being something real. But it pales in comparison to the non-religious.
Before we continue, Chris just joined us. How you doing, Chris?
Doing well, thanks.
All right. D was just describing his experience, his religious experiences, rather, versus his quote-unquote religious experiences as a non-believer. So I'm sorry to interrupt, D, but go ahead and continue if you can.
Basically, my religious experiences that what I consider to be religious they felt like a deep connection with God. like a knowing almost. Like even though I could never feel him or see him, it was kind of like me believing with my emotions in tune that he was there and we were working together in one, or he was watching out for me or whatever. And they were definitely strong feelings when I had them. But as an atheist now, my feelings are much, much more powerful, because I think the reason is because with religion, there was a lot of faith involved. But with reason, when you have reason behind the things that you believe, it just, in all honesty, once you understand like what we know about the cosmos, it's the awe is inherent in the understanding, I think. So it's much more powerful in that way. Any story that religion made up is nothing compared to reality. And I'm not saying I have all of reality figured out, but it's way more real than any religion I was involved with. And the reality of the cosmos is far more worth awe than any religion that I know of.
That's interesting. No, I mean, that's great. That's an interesting way to put it. I mean, I've never really thought about it that way, but what you're getting that sense of awe from is something tangible in some way, something that you can actually rationalize, something that even though you can do that, it doesn't matter. That kind of reminds me, you touched on how you said you had felt this presence in the room. You know, my own little personal anecdote, I know I bring this up a lot on our shows, but I used to be a ghost hunter for the longest time, and while we were searching for ghosts, before we would even do anything in the home, we would always perform an EMF sweep. It's just to try and gauge how much electromagnetic interference is around. And the reason I bring that up is because it's actually pretty well known that these electromagnetic fields can generate a sense of paranoia if you're around it long enough. So at the time, you know, we thought we were simply eliminating contamination from our investigations by doing these sweeps, because if we found that the house just naturally had this much EMF, chances are this is what was creating this sense of paranoia with these people. So, you know, if there was too much EMF radiation, then we would have been incapable of spotting the, quote, legitimate spikes that would potentially indicate the presence of a spirit. You know, the EMF that we were looking for, you know, like I said, it can essentially influence the brain in the same way as something like the God helmet, for example. Have you guys ever heard of the God helmet before?
No.
No. That actually really surprises me. I kind of thought this was a little bit more popular than it is, apparently. But the God helmet was invented by a researcher named Michael Persinger. The helmet was invented as a means to scientifically experiment with and investigate mystical experiences, such as out-of-body experiences or a feeling that a presence is in the room with you. The helmet has even been known to induce a sort of euphoric sensation that's comparable with being filled with the Holy Spirit, say, right? The helmet itself operates by subjecting the brain to a weak electromagnetic pulse in order to generate an electromagnetic field that affects the right temporal lobe. Apparently, out-of-body experiences occur when the right temporal lobe is stimulated in certain ways. So there are legitimate scientific explanations for these experiences that we have, and this is really the point that I want to drive in there. When people are in the dark, for example, and they kind of have that feeling that somebody's in the room with them, or when they're praying and they feel that God's with them in the room or something along those lines, there's a scientific explanation for this. Only about 80% of the participants are actually susceptible to these experiences, the participants that wear the God helmet, meaning that 20% of the population are actually immune to its effects. So I think it's actually relatively plausible that this indicates, I can't remember which philosopher said it, but there are those of us who are so made that we can't believe. Hitchens quotes this guy all the time. The research has actually gotten to the point where they can pre-screen your brain and determine before the experiment even begins whether you fall into that 80 or 20% group.
Really, that's interesting. I've never heard of this. Can you buy one at Target, or is it just experimental?
No, actually, no, that's great. I'm glad you asked, because there are actually commercial products that are very similar to the God helmet available to anyone willing to spot the dough. For example, for the low cost of $285 plus shipping and handling, you can order your very own 8-coil. It's called a Shock T. You can order it from godhelmet.com. The Shock T is the portable equivalent of the God helmet. Though I feel like I have to throw this out there for those of you who might feel the urge to go and buy this. The company that makes this product also makes the claim to be able to ameliorate depression, anxiety, and you name it. So which makes the product sound to me a lot like those 19th century cure-alls that you see in museums from time to time.
Wonder tonics. I do have another caller ready to enter.
Awesome. Let's do it. Who we got?
Okay, give me just a second. Let me add him in here.
Okay.
And we should be there.
Hello.
Hey.
Ooh. How you doing, Rex?
Sick.
Oh.
I'm sorry to hear that.
We're glad to.
All right, we're just going to go ahead and continue our conversation where we left off. So one of the most fascinating applications for this technology, the God helmet, namely, that's already in the works. Michael Persinger, the man who created the God helmet initially, is actually working on projects to hopefully incorporate this technology with virtual reality. Michael Persinger and his team hope to be able to induce legitimate physiological and psychological responses in real time. And I thought this was just insane. I mean, just for normal everyday use, I mean, you might be able to include this type of technology in video games and movies, etc. Like, can you imagine playing a game like Resident Evil and the virtual reality headset that you're wearing can induce fear and anxiety in you, for example? I mean, that would be incredible. I mean, to be completely like going on one of those flying simulations, no airplane, just you flying through the clouds, feeling that sense of euphoria. You can induce this in theory with this sort of technology. And honestly, one thing that I thought about that might be a really interesting application might be, in how we train soldiers in the future. I mean, as it stands right now, all the training that they go through is designed to induce as much stress as possible to weed out the winners from the losers. And there are always going to be certain problems with this sort of training. Even if you're shooting live rounds over their head as they're crawling through the mud under the barbed wire, no matter how into the moment they are, they're always going to know at some level that it's just a simulation. And this sort of technology can actually bypass that in a way. And I thought that might be a really fascinating application for this technology. I mean, being able to train soldiers to be conditioned for battlefield scenarios in ways that are just unthinkable now. And it all came from this urge, this desire to learn about the spiritual realm.
So do people actually believe this helmet provides a authentic religious experience? Like, I'm assuming there's a portion of people who have built a religion around this thing, possibly, right? Or is it just everybody knows it's a gimmick and they feel the awe and they're like, oh, that's pretty cool?
As far as I understand it, the religious experience that one feels when they're wearing this helmet is as real can get. I mean, they've done these experiments with people who are already religious, people who aren't religious, people who have brain disorders, neural disorders.
So I could, myself as an agnostic atheist, would I have a religious, would I take the helmet off and be like, there is a God?
No. So far, yeah, you'll always have that notion when it's all said and done that it was just because you were wearing that helmet. Being an atheist, you can rationalize that. And that's really the distinction that we're trying to make here is that when religious people have real religious experiences in the real world, they don't associate that with the real world. They associate it with the supernatural. So that's kind of. I'm sorry. Does that answer your question? I mean.
Yeah. Well, yeah. But I'm just curious if there's an actual group of people who get together and do this thing, and connect with God on a regular basis.
I've actually heard of people who go so far as to put themselves in, what are they called? Those isolation tanks?
Yeah.
Desensitizing tanks, I can't remember what they're called. And induce this experience with, I've heard of people who do that, while taking acid as well. But I mean.
Oh my God. I cannot think of anything scarier.
I was going to say, it sounds like, it almost sounds like the people who send themselves into sensory deprivation just to achieve hallucinations. Now, the same question could be how. I'm sure that there's been people out there that feel that they have a strong spiritual or religious experience just through sensory deprivation, and it doesn't take much more than a pair of noise-canceling headphones and a ping pong ball. But at the same time, when doing that, most of us, I think, would say, obviously, I know, I can't fully believe in that hallucination because of the fact that I know that I put myself in this sensory deprivation chamber, or some kind of sensory deprivation. But
I could think of like really good comebacks. If I was a religious person, it quiets the
exactly.
the senses, man, and allows you to hear what God's saying to you, sort of stuff.
Yeah, like it centers your chi, kind of a thing.
God, all of those, I think, would come back to faith. That would be the center of that argument. They would say, I just have to believe, I have faith that this is the case. Because for me, that the whole issue of a religious experience, and I grew up in a very religious home, and I had a lot of experiences that felt very real the whole time. But at the same time, I guess my experience was that I always started questioning. I always asked, how can I know that this is true? It was always in the back of my head somewhere. How can I know that this is absolutely true? And I started looking into what is absolute truth and reading a lot of philosophy on that. And then I for myself, I had to come to the decision that the difference between truth or facts and faith was that facts had to be able to be proven true, and faith was 99% belief, and that 1% of doubt, because it couldn't be proven to a point, because otherwise it would be a fact. And when that hit, that for me, that created that sense of, I can't kid myself anymore. I can't pretend that I've crossed that 1% line into fact. But I think that there are a lot of people who don't make that determination. And
I think they're scared to make that determination,
Exactly. Well, I would agree with that. Because it was a scary place for me too. And I started going to, and this was the weird part, I always tried to experiment. So I started going into other religions and trying to find that again. Because once I came to that realization, it kind of, my Christian upbringing kind of crashed down. And I wanted something to fill that void. I needed something to be real. And then so it became, I tried Wicca for a while. And finally felt myself going, I feel silly. I'm sorry. I can't believe that what I'm doing with a candle in the middle of my room with nobody else around and chanting is somehow leading to something magical happening. And I made causal correlations where there were none. I remember distinctly seeing after a lightning storm, after a night doing weird stuff in my bedroom, the next day, lightning storm had passed and a tree had come down. And oh my gosh, I think I did that. And I remember freaking out and telling a friend, oh my gosh, I think I did that. And then I thought about it later and went, no, I'm just being a hysterical teenager. This is ridiculous. I just couldn't tell myself that. So at the time, I really looked for it, and I looked for everything. And I finally came to a point where Qi, I started getting into arguments with some martial arts instructors that I respected very greatly, but they were trying to tell me that I could harness my Qi and hit people from 6 feet. And I looked at them and said, look, I want this to be real. I want it to be real more than anything else in the world. Please, if you could prove it to me and teach it to me so that I could shoot fireballs, I want this.
I know, let's do it.
I want to believe this.
Well, that's it right there, man. Everyone wants to believe. I mean, the fact that the brain mediates spiritual experience is more likely than not to be an unwelcome discovery for the religious folk. I mean, after all, if Joe Blow's religious experience can be manufactured, then how do we know that our own experiences aren't manufactured? And people want to believe that the things that they believe in are true. I mean, otherwise, obviously, they wouldn't believe them. And that's kind of the difference. Like you said, you kind of took that logical, skeptical / philosophical approach to it as well. It's pretty admirable.
Well, so, though, I mean, it was hard. It hurt because I had to come to grips with a whole world that didn't fit into what I wanted it to fit into anymore.
Yeah, it was a tough experience. Since we're on religious experiences, since you were religious when you were younger, Do you have any difference between religious experiences that you may experience now as compared to then? Or would you even call them the same thing? Or do you have anything even remotely close to that?
I think that when we get into the semantics of what is a quote-unquote religious experience,
Sure.
I don't use the word religious to describe them because for me, the semantics of it means an organized religion, an organized faith. And because it's not for that, semantically, I would call it a spiritual experience, but at the same time, I divorce that
Spirit,
from,
yeah, sure.
Kind of thing. But you can call it whatever you want because language to me is nothing but a tool of communication.
Sure.
Ideas. And so when we try to regard it very carefully and try not to read too much into words that aren't there.
So we have to come to some sort of mutual definition if we're going to talk about it, though.
Exactly. So we can call it a spiritual experience. We can call it a religious experience. I don't mind, whichever.
No, but that may mean something totally different to you than it does to me. And I'm curious, like, what we all consider to be a spiritual experience first and foremost to see if there's any common ground between us.
I mean, that's a solid point.
Well, basically, in a nutshell, for me, it's a deep state of awe. Okay. Like a deep state of awe. If I had to put it in just a few words, that's what I would call a spiritual experience for me. Anybody else?
No, I could swallow that. That's pretty bite-sized, man. I dig it.
I would have to say that I totally agree. I would also maybe add that a very strong emotional response.
Sure.
Because it might not be awe. Sometimes it's, for me, it's very powerful emotional response in other ways. But that leads me to awe of the emotion.
Okay. Would it be fair to say that spiritual is that which is luminous to us? Transcendent, if you will. Something
I don't know.
Somehow reveal something enlightening or luminous to me. Yeah, and that can be.
It seems luminous, that's for sure. I'm not sure if it always is. I mean, I felt it with different things that I thought were luminous at the time, and now I would disagree with that.
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's really hard to kind of buckle it down because, I mean, I think it's actually kind of important to note that religious experiences are really nothing more than synaptic activity in an altered brain state.
But that doesn't. I don't know. That's. Chris, will you settle this? Do you have any opinion on this?
You or Mr. Rex?
Yeah,
Mr. Rex. Sorry,
I think it was me, Rex. Yeah. So I don't know. I guess my problem is a couple-fold with this particular situation. One is that I have an issue using the word spiritual because it implies spirit, which implies that humans are somehow special and have souls, which, of course, we know that to be false. So I am very averse to the term spiritual just because of the spirit implication. Mm-hmm. However, I do understand the need to describe something that is an intense feeling. I understand that. Therefore, if you want to describe it as an awe-inspiring event that makes you glow from within emotionally, I mean, I have no issue with that. As far as trying to use this God helmet thing and moving forward, I think there might be a bit of a profitable venture as far as the business is concerned. Just having something that's akin to an oxygen bar, only a God helmet bar.
Or you could just start a cult.
Or, of course.
Hallucinations.
Yeah, I can't remember his name. I'm sorry. Michael Persinger, that's who it was. He actually hopes that someday this technology might be incorporated in your cell phone. For whatever reason. I mean, he really wants it to be...
Like, assuming that this technology is young and they're going to refine it and they would be able to induce all sorts of feelings, it's like the ultimate drug. Like, how could you resist? Like, I feel terrible today. Am I going to feel terrible all day today, or can I just do the God app on my phone?
That's a really good idea right there, the God app. You want a spiritual experience? You want to do your 7 Hail Marys and actually feel like you're accomplishing something? Press 9. I mean, I think
I'm just saying.
Press 9.
It's mine.
Love it. It's yours. Take it, man. Or just start a cult. I'm serious. If anybody's had any ideas or thoughts about starting a cult, here's your opportunity if nobody's taken advantage of it yet. But with any religion, superstition, you can have different sects. So there could be, 3 or 4 competing sects within the God helmet.
Well, yeah, one has to involve snakes. We have to have the snake cult.
You are perfect for this, Mr. Rex.
I know. Look at that. It's great.
So do you think that if this sort of technology does become popular, I mean, literally to the extent where you can dial a number and have these experiences, do you think that they might actually replace drugs? Recreational drugs, I mean?
Well, you would just want to live in a state of like mild awe all day because it's just fun to be in awe, right?
Yeah, it'd certainly make my day at work go by a lot better.
I actually get that experience by watching National Geographic, but maybe that's just me. I don't know.
That's cheating. If I can get it on an app, I would prefer to do that.
I remember growing up, I was listening to my uncle in particular. He was a hardcore musician. He used to tell me he could feel the music. Do you think there's some sort of comparison here? Because, that's kind of what I was getting at. Would you guys call that a religious experience of sorts? Or a spiritual one, at least?
Or like Mr. X said, an inspirational or an intense moment. I think to answer Dee's question, I think that yes, those kinds of things I feel very inspired or very intense, as if or luminous. Often when I'm listening to music that I just really dig. Get into, or when I learn something that just changes my world, or when I make a connection with a student or just another person that I just feel that something has changed me. That is just a remarkably powerful experience. Or when I just meet somebody that I just really jive with, all of a sudden I'm like, wow, of all the billions of people on this planet, this other person that I really automatically get along with, and I don't have to keep my guard up, and we're just able to exist together in this kind of relationship. That's just flooring to me. I don't know. Have you guys ever had anything like that?
Yeah. How about going to a great band? Like a band that you just really dig and like get into their music and can dance the night away, or I don't know. Has anybody else experienced something like that? Being similar?
Absolutely. When I saw Muse play in 2008, there was literally a point in their show where their light show was so fantastic. The music was so amazing, and I was so intensely into it. I'm pretty sure I blacked out.
Wow.
My sensory perceptions were so overloaded, and I was in such a state of thrill that literally I just couldn't see. I knew I was still there. My eyes had just shut down. And
totally sober.
Totally sober.
Wow.
And I will never forget it. There's never been another show like it. Just that powerful.
That's called a flashbang, by the way.
Really?
A flashbang?
Yeah, a flashbang, concussion grenade.
Oh, okay.
That police and military use. Yeah, because it overwhelms all your senses, which is why you end up blacking out or becoming highly disoriented.
Let's kind of continue this conversation and move forward a little bit. Have any of you guys ever heard of a drug called DMT, dimethyltryptamine?
I've heard of it.
Or maybe
apparently, this is the hallucinogen drug of all hallucinogen drugs. I guess this is as good as it gets. It's a psychedelic drug known to induce religious experience. The people that take this claim to lose, their sense of self, creating a sensation of one with the universe, very synonymous with LSD in that way. But as I mentioned, the drug itself is a potent hallucinogen that commonly generates delusions of geometric and fractal imagery, very vivid too. So those. That the artwork that you typically associate with stoners, say in the 70s, that real fractal, geometric stuff. When you take this drug, you literally delve into a state where these are the images that you're seeing more often than not. While at the same time, it disrupts your perception of time dramatically. It's actually begun to make a name for itself. It's often referred to as the spirit molecule. There was a researcher back in the 90s, Dr. Rick Strassman, who performed clinical studies on this drug to see what was going on. And what he ended up finding was that what's going on here is that the brain already creates the chemical DMT naturally in the pituitary gland. But, obviously if you overload it with more DMT, this is when you'll start having these religious experiences. Side note here, since the brain creates DMT naturally, this also helps to explain how people can have these experiences naturally. You can induce a DMT trip through means like meditation or fasting, or if you're in some form of extreme stress and what have you. Now, I feel the need to emphasize here that those on the drug describe religious imagery, such as angelic beings. They'll often describe being in the presence of God. They'll see religious symbols, again with the fractal imagery, and they'll often claim to be, sensing and seeing other beings around them. What I find interesting is that when you have somebody who's not religious take this drug, they'll try to relate their experience, namely, seeing other dimensions or planes of existence, as it were, and try to describe it somewhat like the multiverse in their minds. They'll claim to be able to see colors or light that's beyond the visible spectrum. And these experiences are very real to these people. The drug alters the brain in such a way that it seemingly allows for the ability to perceive information normally beyond our comprehension or capacity to interpret. So most actually describe this as a higher state of consciousness, which, has a very woo-woo shamanistic ring, in my opinion. I just thought that, this was really interesting. I mean, there's actually a tribal people in Brazil that was discovered in the 1930s, the Santo Daime, that create this drink out of the material around them, some sort of leaf. And they've refined it to the point where they can induce a trip into the spirit realm that lasts for hours. And they do this as part of a religious ceremony. And as you can imagine, in recent years, this ceremony has attracted the attention of quite a few tourists. It's actually made its way to the States, too. There was a church that tried to import this drug, this leaf, so that they can perform the ceremony.
It sounds like just a fun drug to take. I'm not really... Are any of you guys interested in trying this? I've heard some people try it to have a greater, higher consciousness or something like that. It hasn't really ever attracted me, but...
Never tried a hallucinogen before. I honestly think that trying LSD one time is on my bucket list at some point. Probably when I'm 50 in my golden years, I have nothing better to do for a week or so. Screw it, let's try it. I've always wanted to try it. Most of the people, all the people rather, that I know that have tried acid say that it changed them spiritually in some way, that it changed them fundamentally and they became more spiritual. Even my atheist friends, I have my best friend in the world. He's atheist, but he still has this belief in spirits and this supernatural realm. And beyond that, I've always wanted to see the ceiling melt and drip through my hand. I think that would be interesting. I've always wanted to see music. I hear that you can see music.
Yeah.
And I know that if I was on DMT, I'd probably be able to see some music. And I think it would be the coolest damn thing in the world to be able to see something like that.
That would be fun. I would think that would be fun, too. If that was guaranteed. Now, I have done LSD before. I've done it twice, and I hated it. Oh, man. I would not say I got any religious or spiritual significance out of it or changed my insight into the living or life. But... no, and I did. I experienced some of that stuff. I remember listening to music and being like, whoa, I remember listening to Beatles music and, I'd heard these Beatles songs for a long, long time and all of a sudden they were the best. It was the best experience listening to the Beatles ever. I still remember that. But that's just a very small portion of it. If you're high on LSD for 6 hours, there's a lot of bad stuff that can sneak up in there too. Is that your spiritual experience story?
Oh, no. The only thing I can compare to that church-like sense that I would get when I thought that I was in the presence of God is, every once in a while, even today, I do sometimes get the feeling that my stepfather, Jack, is in the car with me when I'm driving. He passed away about a year and a half ago. And obviously I'm a hardcore atheist, but I think it's in our genes. I don't, because I know that what I'm experiencing isn't real. but I still feel it anyway. And sometimes I do. I admit. Sometimes I let it take me in. It feels good to think sometimes that he really is sitting there kind of cheering me on every once in a while. I try not to let those moments linger on too long, but because those are the type of thing that make it difficult to do what we were talking about doing earlier, to separate the luminous and the transcendent from the supernatural. Because I don't want to believe in that moment that, oh, it's just my brain confusing me to think that he's here.
Well, I think that's an important point. I hate to cut you off on that, but
go for it.
But I had 2 similar experiences right before I made a huge change in my life. I think I've mentioned in the past moving overseas, and it was completely by choice. It was my choice, and it was one of the hardest things I had ever done, and didn't really know exactly what was going to be involved when I did it. And it was a 1.5 year long process of trying to get through a lot of different difficulties, financial and otherwise, just trying to arrange moving into another country. During that time, my level of stress was at a point that I had never witnessed before. And unintentionally, however it happened, biases and everything, every time I kept thinking, oh my gosh, is this the right thing to do? I would look over and somehow I would look at the clock at 11:11.
Oh, yeah, that happened to me a lot.
Or 1:11 in the afternoon, or 11:11 in the morning, whatever it was. Somehow I kept seeing this, and every time I did that, I felt like there's something special here. I think I'm doing the right thing. Something is telling me that I'm doing the right thing, and it was almost like my psyche's way of reassuring me, or just my stress response. It was my brain trying to find a reason to be okay in the extremely hellishly stressful situation I had put myself under, because there was no other way to deal with it. And eventually I got over there, and eventually had the backwards response of, oh my gosh, this is a giant mistake. This is a terrible thing. I can't believe I did this to myself. And again, started to have this sense of, a friend of mine a long time ago, we had worked together for a while, and he became one of those just best buds, and hadn't even really known him that long. I had only really known him for about a year. But through that, we had been through so much together, we felt like we were brothers. And then he had died in a car accident. And while I was overseas, there were times when, for some silly reason, not thinking about anybody else, than my family or anybody else, but I just felt like, maybe he's looking out for me, or maybe he would want me to do this. He would want me to get through this, and had those feelings, even though my rational mind told me this is ridiculous. There's really no reason for you to be thinking of him. You only knew the guy for a year. But again, I think it was my brain's need. I think it was the human need to feel reassured, to feel like something was there, because it was difficult for me to take all of the stress on my own. And that's a very difficult thing for anyone. I don't think there's one person on this planet that could tell me I can handle all the stress in the world, all of life's problems, without anything. We try to reach, or we try to rationalize, we try to find a way to overcome those stresses. And so I think, in a similar vein, I know logically, rationally, I know even-mindedly that there was no significance of 11/11. There was nothing guiding me to look at that. There was nothing trying to reassure me. And in fact, maybe that might have been a very big mistake. Financially, it cost me quite a bit. But in reality, it really was just a situation that made me who I am as I became who I was. And the way that I chose to deal with it became part of me, and taught me that I can handle stressful situations without needing that, even though at the time it was very reassuring to me. So I think it's interesting to see both sides of that.
That's funny that you saw 1111 and it was like a way of confirming your decisions at the time? Like, and you really held on to that?
Oh, I did. And I don't know why.
That's interesting.
But it's that self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, I was just going to say.
And going, oh, yeah, no, there's got to be something to this. It can't be coincidence.
Right. So, well, I saw 11s all the time, too, for a while. And I knew it was ridiculous. But I just indulge it sometimes. Sometimes these fun things are just fun to indulge. It's like a stroke of luck or something like that. So when I turned 33, I bought 121 lottery tickets. 11 times 11. 3 times, and my birthday added up to 33. Like, I was like, all right, screw it. Maybe maybe the stars are lining up for me. What the hell? So I bought 121 lottery tickets, and I didn't win a single dollar.
I was going to say, how's that working?
There is no 11 God, guys. I'm just letting you know.
No, but Chris's story really is awesome, just because he does get at that point of how good the mind is, the human brain is at drawing connections between things and correlations between things, even when there's nothing there at all. And just his description of resorting to this 11 God, even though he knows it's ridiculous, in his times of stress, he just described the exact scenario that Homo sapiens evolved in. As we were evolving these advanced brains, we evolved the capacity for higher thinking, but at the same time, it caused us problems to where we freak out beyond belief, and we need some sort of foundation, even if that foundation is entirely made up in our minds and has no relevance to the real world. If we at least somehow believe that there's an 11 God, it gives us some sort of reassurance. So he literally just described the birth of religion during the evolution of Homo sapiens.
You're describing, in your situation, the birth of civilization in some ways. That ability to put together connections and come up with superstitions also allow us to like understand the world around us too, correct?
Well, the problem is that in modern day, it really causes more problems than it helps. Hence our large discussions on cognitive biases and such.
Sure.
So that's really the big problem nowadays. But back then, it existed because it was great to have that level of reasoning skill, because more often than not, it helps save your life in one way or another.
How many tens of thousands of years or how many generations does it take for some of these biases that don't serve us to like breed themselves out? Or do they breed themselves out? I mean, well, then are you talking the only way we can counteract it is like education on like a massive scale? Yeah. And we're not doing that.
It comes down to changing the culture to override the genetics.
Oh.
I also think that education is, a highly important part of it, but I also think that it has to be a focused education that includes a generous willingness to engage in critical thinking and teach critical thinking and logic. I personally think that logic should be taught at a very early age.
Me too. What is an education without critical thinking? I mean, it's just.
Because it's one thing to learn math and language arts and social studies and science, all of which I teach, but at the same time, without having that foundation, that's the foundation that ties them all together. Being able to critically think about how to apply each of those, how to cross-reference those, how to build them, to synergize them into a multidisciplinary whole is really something that's at the crux of whether or not somebody feels competent in using them. Mm-hmm. And without that, we certainly can continue to teach them without combining them, without teaching critical thinking, without teaching how to logically use them when they're at the right times. But kind of feel like that's going to give us an educated populace that is hamstrung to use it. A large population that knows a lot and can't do anything with it.
The issue with that is the fact that education is a two-way street.
True.
And the fact that in order to effectively teach, you must have effective learners. It's kind of hard to teach people who don't want to be taught on certain things.
And that's
Right.
very
And that's the direction that we're going in, luckily, as an entire world, is in the direction of more teachable people.
mhm.
Because we are letting go of the old religions and becoming more atheist and agnostic and non-believers. Because honestly, historically speaking, the Bible has been a huge hindrance in education and in freeing the mind and allowing you to critically evaluate everything
I agree.
along the way.
Absolutely.
The only thing I would want to add is, I think that just having a better understanding as we progress and learn more and more about our own neurology, I think that some of these experiences and such, once we can show beyond a reasonable doubt that these are, in fact, nothing more than neurological reactions, if you will. For example, we've observed neurological conditions and their corollary effects on religious experience over time. There's a guy, his name was Patrick McNamara, and he studied the religious and spiritual experiences of people with Parkinson's disease. The fact that they undergo change in their religious experience relative to their measurements at the beginning of their disease, it shows that the circuits are affected by Parkinson's disease, and they're implicated in the neural expression of the religious and the spiritual experiences. So when you look at the data, and you can see that certain brain states induce all of these things, it's honestly, to me, it's like looking at a fossil and trying to deny that dinosaurs ever existed.
Yeah, I know, but that's just not the way most people think.
Well, and
Hey.
I think what the natural next thing to address, though, is the compartmentalization that a lot of people go through when we start to talk about whether or not we can prove that it's simply neural. Because I know a lot of people that I highly respect, very nice, wonderful, kind people, and very intellectual, that I can enjoy a very wonderful conversation with, until it comes to a place where they have compartmentalized their religion, and that's a no-go. We can sit down and have a conversation about neurological effects of serotonin on anything. We can go on and on and on, but as soon as I bring up the topic of, well, do you believe then that a serotonin-induced state of euphoria is the same thing that you possibly could be feeling when you go to church? That's a no-go. They will go,
yeah.
No, it's totally different. But if I said, look, I can prove it. We could set up an experiment and we could do that. Probably, and I kind of believe that even if I did, even if they went through that, they might still, because it is compartmentalized in their brain, try to say, no, it's somehow different. It's hard to disprove it for them. Like Mr. Rex said, we have to have able learners. So they have to be willing learners before we can really reach that or go over that bridge, I think.
That's interesting. Honestly, a conversation needs to be had on dualism versus materialism.
I can agree.
But we're running up on the end of the
There's
show.
plenty to edit.
So now that the show's coming to a close, does anyone have any ending comments that they'd like to add?
I guess I would just like to say it's totally okay to feel like you have an inspiring and very passionate, awe-based experience without a belief in a God. I have many of them.
Yeah, I go to a strip club, and I'm able to admire a fine woman and sit here and wonder, well, are those real or are those silicone? You know what? I don't care. By the end of the day, it doesn't matter. The result is the same.
That's why we didn't ask you what your spiritual experiences were, man.
I got out of class early.
Oh yeah,
man,
I'm glad to have
you're
you.
missed. You're missed, Mr. Rex. Good to have you back.
Miss it.
I love your input. It's got a
Strippers. Who
Good.
knew? Yeah.
exactly. That's what I'm talking about. Screw all the other science stuff. No, good conversation, guys.
Absolutely. All right. Well, anyone who's still listening, thanks for hanging in there.
Hey, thanks for listening, guys. We got to roll. Till next week. Bye-bye.
See you.
Yeah.
That is all the time we have for you this week. This has been the Hoosier Humanist Hour. Be sure to check out FreeThought Fort Wayne on Facebook and on meetup.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope your days are filled with logic, reasoning, and the eternal quest for knowledge.
I love you.